Today, we're talking about counter building on supports. Now, obviously, there are a lot of defense items that are both for magical and physical supports. We'll try and focus mostly on those that work for both, and then address the magical and physical exclusive ones in a shorter segment. We will also go through this by the most popular kind of counters instead of going alphabetical or anything. So we first talk about things like basic attacks and CC and burst, and then go for more specific things like countering anti-heal and stuff like that. Generally, bear in mind that whenever you're playing support, you want some kind of mix of both sorts of defense and some health. So even if you're specifically counter building, you should make sure to include all these aspects, all these elements to some extent in order to have an effective build across the board. Also, not every defensive build works for every support equally well. For example, Sylvanas and Terra can make use of much different items from the rest of the bunch. Those specifics can obviously not be covered in this video, and there will be 4 particular videos on that very characters. With these disclaimers out of the way, let's jump into the items. Let's first talk about basic attacks. There are 3 items available for everyone when it comes to countering basic attacks, mostly from physical characters. The first one and the most common one this day is probably Witchblade. Witchblade is great because it lowers the attack speed of the enemy and it lowers their power without even having to interact with them in any way other than being close to them. So Witchblade is a very solid choice here. On the other hand, it doesn't have the best defensive stats itself. While it does provide you with some tankiness, it is not a full-on tank item, which is why you'll often see it in other roles as well. It's a defensive item with a lot of utility for your team, and should be treated as such. It's something you probably don't want to build too early in the build unless you're against 2 physicals in dual lane, but rather later to specifically counter out basic attack carries on the other team. An item that gets the job done more generally speaking is Midgardian Mail. Midgardian Mail also slows the enemy, in this case attack speed and movement speed. The difference here is that the enemy has to attack you and there's only a chance that it procs. The overall damage decrease of the enemy will be lower compared to Witchblade. However, you yourself will get more defense out of this item, given the fact that it has some health on top of it and some defense, which is just a better mix. So, both have their strength. If I was to tank and I need some more defense, I would rather go for Midgardian. If I already have my defense going, and I just need some extra counter, especially for my team, then I'd recommend Witchblade. There is also Hide of the Nemean Lion. I would generally not recommend that all too much. The problem with Nemean Lion is that the enemy needs to hit you for the effect to work. It's not like Midgardian Mail where it just needs to hit you a few times, but to get the full effect, the enemy has to consistently focus you. If I was an ADC player on the other team and I would see the support building Hide of the Nemean Lion, I would just not attack him. I'd just take care of other characters on the team, which is what you generally try to do as a carry anyways. So, while this item has a bunch of physical defense, it's just something that is hard to justify. And if you're going into the other items and then look to build this one, it becomes even harder to justify because the enemies already deal less damage, so it's also going to reflect less. This is still a great item, but I would rather see it on a solo laner than on a support, personally. There is one more item that would fit here. Like I said, we will address the physical only items later on. The item would be Frostbound Hammer. This brings us to the next category, CC and Burst. Now, the reason I'm combining these two is that basically, whenever you get CC'd, it is followed up by Burst. That's the whole purpose of crowd control. If you get stunned, the enemy is looking for a play of that stun. For example, a Scylla looking to ult you after getting you rooted in place, or a Naja looking to ult you after stunning you, stuff like that. So, as such, item that works against CC will often work against Burst as well. The prime example here is probably Spirit Rope. Spirit Rope lowers the damage you take after getting CC'd. It works against all sorts of damage, and it's generally a very good item that I would recommend almost always building, especially in the mid stages of the game where you don't have enough gold for stuff like Mantle of Discord yet, but you want to have some mixed defense, some CDR, and some crowd control reduction. In the same sense, Mantle of Discord itself is obviously a very strong item in that regard because it gives you that crowd control immunity at low health. So after getting bursted, you will have an opportunity to get out, for example, against an Ao Kuang, who will then be stunned the moment he would ult you, and you will be CC immune and just walk away from him. So it's great for that. Absolutely, totally recommended in that regard. And the third item here is the Magi's Blessing, which simply prevents some crowd control from happening. Magi's Blessing is a little weaker than the other two, I would say, but it's not as bad. It's a bit underrated in regards to what it can do, simply because if you have the other two, and you get the even more CC immunity on top of that, it can be very, very potent. You just give up a lot of team utility that way. But if the enemy team has enough burst, I would totally see it working. In the same sense, there is Bulwark of Hope. Bulwark of Hope has more magical defense than anything really. It has the health and shield, which typically prevents you from taking or dying by burst in the first place. You're going to take a lot of damage, but you still have some crowd control reduction to not be CC'd as long, and then you get a shield, so you're most likely not going to die from something that would have otherwise killed you. At the same time, Bulwark of Hope is one of those items that while providing you with a lot of effective health, it doesn't really do all too much for your team. You don't get any extra cooldown reduction, you don't get any extra aura for your team, so it's a bit of a downside there. Another form of crowd control are slows. Slows are a specific form of soft crowd control, and as such, there is only one item that counters them, and that's Witchblade. When the enemy team has a lot of slows, just get Witchblade, simple as that. It speeds you up when you should get slowed, and that's amazing, and that's why this item will probably always be in the meta unless it sees some nerfs. It also has other beneficial stats, so there is a lot of room for justification to pick it up. There are multiple anti-heal items in the game, but only one that really works for supports in my opinion, and that's Pestilence. Yes, obviously there is Divine Ruin, but you're giving up so many defensive stats by building it that I would hardly ever find the justification for it, and instead go for Pestilence, which also provides you with magical defense and health, and as such is a great item, especially because most sources of heal are from magical characters, with a few exceptions obviously. While we're already talking about healing, let's talk about countering anti-heal. So basically countering Pestilence or countering a curse. There is Rod of Asclepius, which basically overrides anti-heal. So if you were to get 100% anti-healing, or you get 100% anti-healed, and you would have Rod of Asclepius, you would still get the additional healing from that, which wouldn't be much, but it would counter out a fair bit at least, and give you some heal. So if you get countered by anti-heal items, then you can go Rod of Asclepius. This can even be built on a support that doesn't heal himself, as long as there are other teammates that heal, for example, a Ra or something like that, if you feel like it's justifiable to get that on your support for the movement speed and the healing and the health of the item, potentially trading out boots and going for a combination with Blink Blade. There is also one item to counter structures, and that's Emperor's Armor. Now this item is not used very much, but the purpose is there. It could be used for defense and tower sieging as well, or like getting sieged rather, but it doesn't seem to be all that effective in that regard. But if you're trying to press onto the enemy towers or Phoenix as fast and as hard as possible, then this item can actually help you and it can be viable. In the same sense, there is a single item that specifically counters crits to some extent, and that's Celestial Legion Helmet. Different from Emperor's Armor, I wouldn't really recommend building it. It does have a decent amount of defense, but the benefit is that you get more power, and more power is not really that helpful for support, so I would kind of generally recommend against it. Now we're going a little less specific. We're going for items that just generally counter physical damage. There is Sovereignty that helps your whole team and is great as such, gives you some sustain and has a good mix of stats. So that's generally your item you want to go for early against heavy physical damage. There's Breastplate of Valor, which gives you some CDR on top, so this is especially great for healing characters, healing supports and stuff like that, and allows for a bit more aggression while giving you a lot of physical defense. Similarly, there is Dynasty Plate Helm, which can be bought early on certain supports if you want to go for a lot of aggression. I would generally see it more in solo lane, but I've done it on, for example, on support Cabrakan, just to get some early power and early kill potential going for your support, and then go into more defensive choices afterwards. A great item for physical defense early on is Mark of the Vanguard. This can be rushed as early as before even finishing your boots, so a very, very good choice after Watcher's Gift, or later in the game still. It is so potent that I would generally recommend it until very late stages of the game actually, when you just need that immediate extra defense against physicals with a good mix of stats. There is also Spectral Armor, which can be used, which has a decent amount of physical defense. The thing here is that it has more of a niche use and you really need to utilize it properly, so maybe it's not for everyone, but it's there and it's good for that. There's also Mystical Mail, which theoretically will work in that way, but I wouldn't recommend it as it is more of a solo lane item, if anything really. When it comes to straight magical defense, with those items we've already mentioned, like Bulwark, the selection is a little smaller. Generally, there is always Hardwood Amulet, which helps your whole team against magical damage and is very good in that regard. If it's more for yourself, you can either decide for Genji's Guard, which gives you some cooldown reduction on top, which can be very good on support, so I really like that choice. Or if you feel like you need even more magical defense, there's also Oni Hunter's Garb. Now, Oni Hunter's Garb has some similarities with Bulwark of Hope, both having a magical protection and crowd control reduction, but it works a little differently as you're rather not taking the burst in the first place by having extra magical protection before than as with Bulwark where you just prevent taking further damage by getting the shield. So both work in their own ways, depending on what you need more. If you need more health or more magical protection, I would recommend either. Quick honorable mention for Void Zone, obviously gives some magical defense as well while helping your team. Maybe as a late game choice, not really a defensive item though. Moving on, we'll take a quick moment to talk about the items that are not specifically counters, but rather all-rounders. Heart of the Urchin is your go-to item if you just want more defense in general. It is good on almost every support. It gives you a lot of tankiness, and it, while not helping your team, is a very effective item. You have Mail of Renewal, which kind of functions similarly, more or less. It's more of a utility item and should be built later, but it's also nothing that counters anything in specific. Same goes for Ritual Dagger. Once again, a good item that doesn't really focus on one particular aspect. It has health and works in various ways. Then you have Stone of Gaia, which just gives you a nice sustain and is, something that you can pick up. There's Ethereal Stuff, which also doesn't really have any particular defensive purpose, but allows you to deal a little more damage, which is nice late game. And there's Lotus Crown, which does amplify the defenses of your allies while healing them. So while it's a utility pickup that kind of helps everyone in the same way with multiple sources of defense, it is specifically for healers only, so that makes it a little more specific than the others, and still something that is just generally used against damage. And last but not least, let's go over the physicals only support items. Not all of these are necessarily straight up support, but they kind of can be built in the role depending on the situation. First one is Frostbound Hammer. Frostbound Hammer is great for slows. It kind of works the same as Midgardian Mail. It also works in synergy with Witchblade at the moment, so it's something that's definitely worth keeping in mind. There is Runic Shield, which is more of a mage ADC or mage basic attack focused counter, so it's good against Freya, it's good against Kronos, it's good against Sol, and it should be utilized if you can. It's a very good item, but sometimes, or more often, you will also rather see this on the solo laner. There is Void Shield, once again, similar purpose, but mostly built by a jungler or solo laner, so you rarely need to build it. Physical defense in addition with extra damage for your teammates. Then we have Ancile, which is countering mages in particular. I do not think it's all that great on most supports because it just doesn't have the defensive stats to back it up, really, but it can be used sometimes and it can be good in some situations. It's only very niche that you're going to play a physical support and be dependent on a heavy mage counter item that doesn't work with the defense in general, but silencing them. Then there's also Shifter's Shield, but Shifter's Shield is more of a damage item in my opinion. Can be used in a defensive build late game, but once again, rather for solo laners than for supports. A very, very last mention goes to Gem of Isolation. This is not really a counter item or anything, it's not a high defense item. What it does though is it slows the enemies, so it's a bit of a setup item. And as such, there are some situations where it can be built on certain supports. For example, once again, if you play Cabrakan as support, it can work. But those scenarios are very, very rare. You will notice that I left out some defense items. That was on purpose. I don't think the other items are really that viable as a support for various reasons that I'm not going to go into detail here. I may go into more detail about specific aspects of this video, like the attack speed countering and how they work together and stuff like that, in another video. For this one, I think I've covered enough info. I will hopefully be able to do some kind of a visual info chart for this as well, which I will then link down below. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke SLOTH, out.